They thought kicking her out would solve their problem, but they had no idea they had just removed the only reason their company was still alive. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. Now, back to Emily Carter. The glass walls of Carter Industries reflected the late afternoon sunlight like a polished mirror, casting long golden streaks across the marble floor as executives in tailored suits gathered around the long conference table, their voices low but tense, each word carefully measured, each glance carrying the weight of a company on the edge. At the far end of the room, seated quietly with a slim notebook in her hands, Emily Carter blended into the background so completely it was almost intentional, her soft gray cardigan and simple blouse standing in quiet contrast to the sharp navy suits and silk ties surrounding her. At 38, Emily carried herself with a calm that came not from confidence alone, but from understanding, the kind that didn't need to be announced. Yet to everyone else in that room, she was little more than an afterthought. Revenue dropped another 12% this quarter, Daniel Carter said, his voice cutting through the tension as he stood at the head of the table, clicking through a presentation that displayed declining graphs in unforgiving red. If we don't stabilize cash flow within the next 60 days, we're looking at layoffs. A murmur rippled through the room, executives shifting uncomfortably, adjusting cufflinks, avoiding eye contact. Richard Carter, the chairman and patriarch, leaned back in his leather chair, his silver hair catching the light, his expression carved from years of authority and expectation. "We didn't build this company to watch it crumble," he said coldly. "We need solutions, not excuses." Emily's pen moved quietly across the page, her handwriting neat, deliberate, almost detached from the urgency surrounding her, but her eyes missed nothing. Every number, every hesitation, every miscalculation hung in the air like something she had already seen before. "We should consider liquidating non-performing divisions," one executive suggested. "Or bringing in external investors," another added quickly. Daniel nodded, but his jaw tightened, frustration evident. "We've explored those options," he replied. "No serious investor is willing to step in right now." The words settled heavily, and for a moment the room fell into a strained silence, broken only by the faint hum of the city outside the glass walls. And then, almost inevitably, Daniel's gaze drifted to the far end of the table, landing on Emily. It lingered for just a second too long, the faintest hint of irritation crossing his face. "I'm curious," he said, his tone sharpening. "Why are you even here?" The question hung in the air, not loud, but deliberate enough to draw attention. A few executives exchanged glances, some lowering their eyes, others watching with quiet interest. Emily looked up slowly, her expression calm, unbothered, as if she had expected the moment. "I was asked to attend," she said simply. Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head as he turned slightly toward the others. "This is a strategic meeting," he said, his voice louder now, carrying a subtle edge of dismissal. "We're discussing serious financial decisions." A faint ripple of restrained amusement moved through the room, quickly masked, but impossible to ignore. Emily didn't respond. She simply held his gaze for a moment longer before lowering her eyes back to her notes, her silence doing more than any argument could have. And somewhere in that quiet, something shifted, though no one in that room recognized it yet. Because while they debated survival, while they searched desperately for solutions they couldn't see, the one person who already knew the answer sat quietly among them, unnoticed, underestimated, and moments away from being pushed out of the very room that depended on her the most. The faint echo of Daniel's question still lingered in the air as the meeting pressed forward, but something about the atmosphere had shifted, subtle yet undeniable, like a tension no one could quite name. Emily remained seated at the far end of the table, her posture composed, her pen gliding steadily across the page, as if the conversation unfolding around her was nothing more than background noise, yet every word spoken seemed to land precisely where she expected it to. Daniel resumed his presentation, clicking to the next slide, a projection of projected losses stretching across the screen in stark red lines. "If this trend continues," he said, his voice tightening despite his attempt at control, "we are looking at a potential shortfall of at least $20 million within the next quarter." A quiet murmur spread across the room again, sharper this time, more anxious. One of the senior executives leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What about the private equity firms we approached last month?" he asked. Daniel exhaled slowly, clearly irritated. "They declined," he replied. "Every single one of them." Another voice chimed in, more urgent now. "Then what about internal restructuring? We could cut operational costs by at least 15% if we streamline." "We have already done that," Daniel interrupted, his tone edged with impatience. "There is nothing left to cut without damaging the core structure of the company." The room grew quieter, heavier, the weight of reality settling in. Richard tapped his fingers lightly against the polished table, the soft sound echoing in the silence. "So what you are saying," he said slowly, his voice low and controlled, "is that we are out of options." Daniel hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "Not entirely," he said quickly, though the confidence in his voice did not quite reach his eyes. "We just need to find the right opportunity." Emily's pen paused for the first time, just briefly, almost imperceptibly. Then it continued moving again. Across the table, one of the board members shifted in his seat, glancing once more toward Emily before leaning closer to Daniel. "No offense," he said in a lowered voice that was still loud enough to carry, "but maybe we should focus on input from people who are actually involved in the financial side of things." A few subtle nods followed. The message was clear. Emily did not belong in this conversation. Daniel straightened slightly, as if encouraged by the support. "Exactly," he said, his gaze flicking toward Emily again. "This is not a place for observers." The word lingered, sharp and deliberate. Emily looked up again, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady and unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though she might speak, as though she might offer something, but instead, she simply closed her notebook with a quiet, precise motion and rested her hands on top of it. The small sound of the cover meeting the pages echoed more than it should have in the otherwise silent room. No one commented, but several eyes shifted in her direction. Richard noticed. He always noticed. His gaze settled on her, assessing, calculating, as if trying to place something that did not quite fit. "Emily," he said finally, his voice measured, "if you have something to contribute, now would be the time." The room stilled. Every eye turned. For a single second, the entire company seemed to hold its breath. Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm, even almost gentle when she spoke. "You are not looking in the right place," she said. A faint crease appeared between Daniel's brows, irritation flaring instantly. "And where exactly should we be looking?" he asked, the challenge clear in his tone. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, her expression unchanged, then glanced briefly at the screen displaying the falling numbers. "At what is actually keeping you afloat," she replied quietly. A beat passed, then another. Daniel let out a short laugh, dismissive and sharp. "We are aware of our financial structure," he said. "Thank you." A few quiet chuckles followed, tension releasing just enough to allow the dismissal to settle in. Emily did not react. She simply gave a small nod as if acknowledging something unspoken and fell silent once more. And in that silence, while the room returned to its anxious debate, while voices rose again in search of answers that seemed just out of reach, no one realized that the one person who had just pointed directly at the truth had already been dismissed without a second thought. The faint echo of Emily's words lingered longer than anyone in the room was willing to admit, hanging quietly beneath the surface of resumed conversations, like a truth that refused to fully disappear. Daniel clicked to another slide, his movements sharper now, more deliberate, as if trying to regain control of something slipping just beyond his reach. "We need actionable strategies," he said firmly, scanning the room, avoiding her gaze this time. "Not vague observations." The executives nodded, eager to move forward, eager to align themselves with authority. One of them leaned in again, voice measured but pointed. With all due respect, we are dealing with institutional-scale financial pressure. This is not theoretical. We need concrete proposals. The implication was clear. Emily's input had already been categorized, dismissed, filed away as irrelevant. At the far end of the table, she remained still, her hands resting lightly on the closed notebook, her expression unchanged, but her eyes moved once more across the screen, tracing the same numbers that everyone else seemed to be struggling to understand. The red lines, the projections, the missing piece that no one was naming out loud. Richard leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled, his voice cutting through again with quiet authority. "Daniel," he said, "we cannot afford to continue circling the problem. Either we secure capital or we prepare for structural contraction. There is no middle ground." Daniel nodded, but there was a flicker of uncertainty beneath the surface, something small but undeniable. "We are exploring all avenues," he replied, though his tone carried less certainty than before. The room shifted again, the tension tightening, the sense of urgency growing sharper with every passing second. And then, almost casually, Daniel turned his head once more, his patience thinning, his tolerance exhausted. His eyes landed on Emily again. "You said we are not looking in the right place," he said, his voice now edged with challenge. "So enlighten us. What exactly are we missing?" The question was not an invitation. It was a test, a subtle trap designed to expose her as out of her depth. The room quieted once more, not out of respect this time, but anticipation. Emily lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his eyes without hesitation. For a brief moment, the silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, the kind that made people shift in their seats without realizing it. She could feel every expectation in the room pressing toward her, every assumption already written in their minds. She did not rush. She did not fill the silence. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, almost understated. "You are trying to replace something that has not left," she said. A faint crease formed on Daniel's forehead, confusion flickering across his face before irritation quickly replaced it. "That does not make any sense," he replied sharply. A few quiet murmurs followed, agreement rippling through the room. One executive leaned back slightly, arms crossed. "If you have a point," he said, "you should make it clearly." Emily's gaze shifted briefly to the financial projections again, then back to the room, her expression unchanged. "Your problem is not that you are losing money," she said quietly. "It is that you do not know where it is actually coming from." The words landed, soft but precise, like something placed exactly where it needed to be. And for a fraction of a second, something in the room shifted again. Not understanding. Not yet. But doubt. Daniel let out a short laugh, louder this time, the sound cutting through the moment before it could settle. "We are very aware of our revenue streams," he said, his voice firm, dismissive. "This is not a guessing game." A few of the executives nodded quickly, reassured by the certainty in his tone. The tension broke just enough for them to retreat back into familiar ground. But Emily did not respond. She simply watched him for a moment longer, her expression unreadable, as if she had just confirmed something she already suspected. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not to him, but to herself. And in that quiet, unnoticed gesture, something final settled into place. Because while the room returned to its arguments, while voices rose again in search of solutions that continued to evade them, Emily Carter had already reached a decision. And unlike the rest of them, she was not searching for a way to save the company anymore. She was deciding whether it deserved to be saved at all. The room did not notice the moment Emily Carter stopped trying to be heard, because nothing about her outward demeanor changed. Her posture remained composed, her expression calm, her presence as quiet and unobtrusive as it had always been, yet internally something had shifted with a clarity that did not require words. Around her, the discussion grew louder, more fragmented, executives speaking over one another as urgency turned into frustration, each suggestion colliding with the same unspoken reality that no one could seem to solve. Daniel's voice cut through again, sharper now, less controlled. We cannot sit here and pretend this is manageable, he said, pacing slightly behind his chair. If we do not secure immediate capital, this company will not survive the year. The statement hung heavy, more final than anything said before. A few heads lowered. Others exchanged tense glances. Richard remained still, but his jaw tightened, the weight of decades of leadership pressing silently against him. Then we act, he said firmly. We identify liabilities and we remove them. The word liabilities lingered in the air, deliberate, calculated. It was not just about divisions or expenses. It was about people. It always was. Emily's gaze lifted slightly at that, not in reaction, but in recognition. She had heard that tone before. She understood what came next before anyone said it out loud. One of the board members leaned forward, his voice cautious but direct. We need to evaluate every non-contributing element, he said. Anything that does not actively support profitability has to be reconsidered. A subtle shift followed, almost imperceptible but real. Eyes moved, not openly, not obviously, but enough. Daniel stopped pacing. His gaze drifted again, slower this time, more deliberate, until it landed on Emily once more. There was no humor in his expression now, only impatience. You have been sitting here this entire time, he said, his tone no longer questioning but concluding. Taking notes, making observations. A pause, but not contributing anything of value. The words landed flat, cold, stripped of pretense. No one interrupted. No one disagreed. Emily met his gaze calmly, her eyes steady, offering no defense, no reaction. That silence seemed to irritate him more than any argument could have. This is a business, Daniel continued, his voice rising just enough to fill the room. Not a classroom, not a place to sit quietly and pretend to understand what is happening. A few executives shifted, uncomfortable now, but still silent. The tension had crossed a line. It was no longer subtle. Richard finally spoke, his voice measured but firm. Daniel, he said, though he did not immediately correct him. His eyes moved to Emily, assessing, weighing something unseen. If you are here, he added slowly, then there should be a reason. The expectation was clear. Explain yourself. Justify your presence. Earn your place. Emily held his gaze, and for the first time there was the faintest trace of something deeper behind her calm. Not emotion, not anger, but certainty. She opened her notebook again, flipping it closed once more as if confirming there was nothing left to record. Then she placed it gently on the table and rose to her feet. The soft sound of her chair moving against the polished floor seemed louder than it should have. Several heads turned more directly now. The room quieted, not out of respect but anticipation. You are right, she said quietly. The simplicity of the statement caught them off guard. Daniel frowned slightly. About what? He asked. Emily's gaze moved across the room once, taking in every face, every assumption, every quiet dismissal that had been building since the moment she walked in. Then she looked back at him. This is a business, she said. A beat passed. And I do not belong in a room where people cannot recognize what is keeping it alive. The words were calm, measured, but they landed with a weight no one immediately understood. Daniel let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking his head. If you think you are somehow contributing to this situation, Daniel. Richard's voice cut in, sharper now, though not yet corrective. He was watching her more closely this time. Something in her tone had shifted, and he could feel it, even if he did not yet understand it. Emily did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Daniel. You asked why I am here, she said. You just answered it. Another pause. The room held still, caught between dismissal and something else, something unrecognized. Daniel's patience finally snapped. This is not productive, he said flatly. He gestured toward the door. If you are not contributing to the solution, then you are part of the problem. The sentence hung in the air, final, decisive. A few executives avoided eye contact. Others watched openly now, curiosity replacing discomfort. Emily did not move immediately. She stood there for a moment longer, as if allowing the weight of his words to settle exactly where they needed to. Then, without argument, without hesitation, she gave a small, almost polite nod. And in that quiet gesture, She accepted something they did not yet realize they had just decided for themselves. The silence that followed Daniel's words did not break immediately. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if the room itself was waiting for something more, something final, but none of them realized it had already happened. Emily Carter reached for her notebook, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as though she had already detached herself from everything around her. From the voices, the tension, the unspoken hierarchy that had just pushed her out without a second thought. She closed the notebook fully this time, aligning its edges with quiet precision, then placed it under her arm as she turned toward the door. No one stopped her. No one called her back. A few executives shifted in their seats, their discomfort visible now, but still not enough to challenge what had just taken place. Daniel exhaled sharply, already turning back toward the screen, dismissing the moment as insignificant as resolved. "Now that we can focus," he said, his voice regaining its earlier authority, "we need to make decisions quickly." The meeting resumed almost immediately, conversations picking up where they had left off, as if removing her had cleared the path forward. Behind them, the sound of Emily's heels against the marble floor echoed softly, each step steady, controlled, fading gradually as she approached the door. She paused for just a moment with her hand resting lightly on the handle, her reflection faintly visible in the glass panel beside it, calm, composed, unchanged. Then she opened the door and stepped out without looking back. The door closed quietly behind her with a soft click that seemed almost too small to matter. But inside the room, something shifted again, subtle, almost imperceptible. Daniel clicked to another slide, numbers filling the screen once more, projections and forecasts that now seemed even more urgent. "We need to identify immediate liquidity options," he continued, his voice firm. "Short-term, mid-term, anything that stabilizes cash flow." One executive raised a hand slightly. "What about the Carter Growth Fund?" he asked. "That has been our most consistent performer over the last 5 years." Daniel nodded briefly. "It is stable," he admitted, "but it is already allocated. We cannot rely on it for additional capital without restructuring the entire portfolio." Richard's gaze shifted at that, his expression tightening slightly. "That fund is the only reason our margins have not collapsed," he said quietly. "We should be examining it more closely." Daniel hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "We have," he replied. "It is performing as expected." The conversation moved on, but the tension did not ease. If anything, it deepened, the weight of uncertainty pressing harder against every decision, every suggestion falling short of what they needed. Minutes passed. Voices rose and fell. Ideas surfaced and were dismissed, and slowly, almost without warning, the cracks began to show. "These projections do not make sense," one of the analysts said suddenly, leaning forward, his voice uncertain. "If our losses are this high, then the growth fund should not be covering this much of the gap." Another executive frowned, pulling up additional data on his tablet. "He is right," he said. "The numbers do not align." Daniel's expression tightened. "What are you talking about?" he asked sharply. The analyst swallowed, glancing at the screen again. "The growth fund is not just supporting the company," he said slowly. "It is carrying it." A silence fell, not the earlier kind, not dismissive, not impatient. This one was different, heavy, real. Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Explain," he said. The analyst hesitated, then turned the tablet toward the center of the table, his hand unsteady. 100% of our net positive revenue over the last 18 months, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, is coming from that fund. The words settled into the room like something undeniable. Daniel stared at the numbers, his jaw tightening, his confidence faltering for the first time. "That is not possible," he said, though his voice lacked certainty now. No one responded. No one needed to. Because for the first time since the meeting began, the room was no longer searching for answers. It had just found the question they should have been asking all along. And somewhere beyond the closed door, the one person who already knew the answer was no longer in the room to give it. The air inside the boardroom shifted in a way that no presentation slide could explain. A quiet unraveling that began not with raised voices or sudden realization, but with the slow, creeping understanding that something fundamental had been overlooked. Daniel remained standing at the head of the table, his hand resting on the edge as he stared at the tablet now placed before him, the numbers no longer abstract projections, but something far more precise, far more damning. "Run it again," he said, his voice controlled but thinner than before. The analyst nodded quickly, fingers moving across the screen as additional data populated the display, layers of financial reports unfolding with clinical clarity. No one spoke. No one moved. The room held its breath as the figures recalculated, confirming what had just been said moments earlier. 100%, not partial, not majority, everything. Richard leaned forward slowly, his expression tightening as he studied the data himself, his years of experience allowing him to read between the numbers faster than most. "This fund," he said quietly, "is not supporting us." A pause. "It is sustaining us entirely." The words landed heavily, stripping away any illusion that had been left. Daniel straightened slightly, his jaw tightening as he tried to reassert control over a situation that was slipping rapidly beyond his grasp. "That still does not explain where the capital is being directed from," he said, though the confidence in his tone had fractured. "We know the fund exists, we know it is performing, but we have full oversight of all internal accounts." The analyst hesitated again, this time more noticeably, his eyes flicking briefly toward the door, then back to the screen. "Sir," he said carefully, "that is the issue." Daniel frowned. "What issue?" The analyst swallowed, then tapped the screen, bringing up a new layer of information, one that had not been included in the earlier presentation. "The Carter Growth Fund is not structured as a traditional internal asset," he explained. "It is privately controlled." A ripple moved through the room, sharper this time, confusion mixing with something closer to concern. "Privately controlled by who?" Daniel asked, his voice sharper now, demanding. The analyst did not answer immediately. He hesitated just long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable, then turned the tablet so that everyone could see the final line of ownership listed at the bottom of the report. The name was simple, clear, undeniable: Emily Carter. For a moment, no one reacted, not because they did not understand, but because they did. The realization did not come all at once. It unfolded, slowly, painfully, as each person in that room processed what it meant. Richard's expression changed first, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who did not know him well, but something in his posture shifted, something in his eyes sharpened as memory aligned with fact. He began, then stopped, as if the sentence itself was difficult to complete. Daniel stared at the screen, his mind racing, trying to reconcile the image of the quiet woman who had just walked out with the data now in front of him. "That is not possible," he said, though the words lacked conviction. "She does not have that kind of capital." No one responded, because the numbers did. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of realization, full of consequences, full of a truth that could no longer be ignored. Richard leaned back slowly, his gaze drifting toward the closed door at the far end of the room, the same door Emily had walked through just minutes ago. "Call her," he said quietly. Daniel did not move. His eyes remained fixed on the screen as if looking at it long enough might change what it said. "Call her," Richard repeated, his voice firmer this time. A beat passed. Then Daniel reached for his phone, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if each action carried a weight he had not felt before. He scrolled through his contacts, found her name, and pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, no answer. The room remained silent, every person listening to the sound of something slipping further away with each unanswered ring. Daniel ended the call, his grip tightening slightly around the phone. "She is not picking up," he said. Richard did not respond immediately. His eyes remained on the door, and in that moment the realization settled fully into place. They had not just dismissed her, they had not just underestimated her. They had removed the only person who had been holding everything together. And now, for the first time since the meeting began, the room understood exactly what it had cost them. The silence in the boardroom did not break after the call ended. It deepened, settling over the space like a weight no one could lift. Each person staring at the same set of numbers, yet seeing something entirely different now, something they had all missed until it was too late. Daniel slowly lowered his phone onto the table, the faint sound of it touching the polished surface echoing louder than it should have, his expression no longer controlled, no longer confident, but fractured in a way he could not conceal. "She knew," one of the executives said quietly, almost to himself. The words were not directed at anyone, yet they landed on everyone. Richard remained still, his gaze fixed on the empty chair at the far end of the table, the one Emily had occupied just minutes earlier, his mind replaying every moment of the meeting with a clarity that sharpened with each passing second. The way she listened, the way she spoke, the way she stopped speaking. "She told us," he said finally, his voice low, measured, but carrying a weight that silenced even the faintest movement in the room. Daniel looked up, his brow tightening. "What do you mean?" Richard did not look at him. "You are not looking in the right place," he repeated quietly, the exact words, unchanged, unavoidable. A realization moved through the room, slow and uncomfortable as memory aligned with fact. She had not been guessing. She had not been offering opinions. She had been telling them the truth. And they had dismissed it without hesitation. Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes shifting again toward the closed door, as if expecting it to open, as if expecting her to walk back in and correct everything the way she always had, quietly, without recognition. But the door remained still. "We need to get her back," one of the board members said, his voice urgent now, the first to openly acknowledge what the room had been avoiding. "If she controls the fund, then she controls our survival." The statement hung heavy, stripped of ego, stripped of pretense. It was no longer about authority. It was about dependency. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand running through his hair as he tried to process the shift in power that had just taken place. "She is family," he said, though the words sounded weaker than intended. "She is not going to just walk away." Richard's gaze finally moved, settling on Daniel with a sharpness that cut through the remaining illusion. "We already asked her to leave," he said. The room went still again, completely still. The weight of that truth settled deeper than anything else. It was not that she had walked away, it was that they had pushed her out, deliberately, publicly, without hesitation. Daniel swallowed, his confidence unraveling further as the implications became impossible to ignore. "Then we fix it," he said quickly, almost defensively. "We apologize, we bring her back into the discussion." No one responded immediately, because for the first time, they all understood something that had been invisible before. This was not a negotiation anymore. This was not a matter of convincing someone to return. The balance had shifted entirely. The control they believed they held had never actually been theirs. Richard leaned back slightly, his expression no longer just concerned, but reflective, as if measuring something far beyond the immediate crisis. "You do not bring someone back into a room you removed them from," he said quietly. "Not when they were the only reason the room mattered in the first place." The words landed with finality. No argument followed. No one tried to correct him, because deep down, each of them understood the same thing now. Emily Carter had never needed that seat at the table. The table had needed her. And the moment they failed to see that, they had already lost far more than just a voice in the room. The realization did not fade, it sharpened, settling into every corner of the boardroom with a clarity that left no room for denial. And for the first time since the meeting had begun, no one attempted to speak over it. No one rushed to fill the silence, because there was nothing left to argue, only consequences to face. Daniel stood motionless, his earlier authority replaced by something far more fragile, his mind racing through every moment that had just passed, every word he had said, every dismissal that now echoed back with a weight he could not undo. "Find her," he said suddenly, his voice tighter than before, no longer commanding, but urgent. One of the assistants near the door hesitated for a brief second, then nodded quickly and stepped out into the hallway. The door closed again, leaving the room suspended in a tension that no one could escape. Richard remained seated, his gaze still fixed on the empty chair, but his expression had changed in a way that was impossible to ignore now. Not anger, not frustration, but something deeper, something closer to recognition. "This did not start today," he said quietly. No one interrupted. "She has been carrying this company for years," he continued, his voice steady, each word measured. "And we never asked how." The statement lingered, cutting through the room with a precision that left no space for excuses. One of the executives shifted uncomfortably. "We assumed it was internal performance," he said, though even he sounded unconvinced. Richard shook his head slightly. "We assumed," he repeated. A few moments passed before the assistant returned, her expression uncertain. "She is not in the building," she said carefully. Daniel's head snapped toward her. "What do you mean she is not in the building?" he demanded. "She left," the assistant replied. "Security confirmed she exited the building about 10 minutes ago." The words landed harder than expected. 10 minutes. That was all it had taken. 10 minutes for the balance of power to shift completely, for control to move from one side of the table to the other without a single raised voice or dramatic gesture. Daniel ran a hand through his hair again, pacing now, the controlled environment of the boardroom no longer offering him the stability it once did. "Then track her," he said quickly. "Call her again. Contact her assistant. Do whatever it takes." The urgency in his voice was unmistakable, but it did not carry the same authority it once had. It carried something else now: dependence. Across the table, one of the senior executives spoke carefully, choosing his words with precision. "If she controls the fund," he said, "then she is not obligated to continue supporting us." The sentence hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Daniel stopped pacing. The implications settled in slowly, but once it did not leave. "She would not do that," he said, though the certainty was gone, replaced by something closer to hope. No one responded, because none of them knew. Not really. Richard finally leaned forward again, his hands resting on the table, his gaze moving across each person in the room, not as a leader commanding a team, but as someone acknowledging a truth they had all contributed to. "You did not see her," he said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than anything spoken before. "You did not listen when she spoke, and when she chose silence, you mistook it for absence." The room went completely still. Every word landed exactly where it needed to. Daniel looked toward the door again, as if expecting it to open, as if expecting her to return and restore order to something that now felt dangerously unstable. But the door remained closed, and in that stillness, the final understanding settled in. Emily Carter had not just walked away from the room. She had walked away from the illusion that she needed it. And now, for the first time, the people inside that room were forced to confront what it meant to no longer be needed by the one person they could not replace. The boardroom did not return to normal after that moment, because there was no version of normal left to return to. Only a quiet awareness that something irreversible had already taken place, something no emergency plan or financial adjustment could undo. The screens still displayed numbers, projections still filled the walls, but none of it carried the same meaning anymore, because now they knew exactly what those numbers depended on, and more importantly, who. Daniel stood near the head of the table, but the position no longer held the same weight. His earlier confidence replaced by a silence he could not escape, his mind replaying every word Emily had spoken, every moment he had dismissed her, every second he had failed to see what had been right in front of him. Richard slowly rose from his chair, the movement deliberate, steady, drawing the attention of everyone in the room without a single word. His gaze moved once more toward the empty seat, then to the closed door, and finally across the people seated around the table, each one carrying the same realization in different forms. "We built a structure," he said quietly, his voice calm but heavier than before, "and we assumed it would stand because of what we put into it." He paused, letting the words settle, but we never questioned what was actually holding it up. No one responded. No one could, because the answer was no longer theoretical. It was gone. The assistant's phone rang softly near the doorway, breaking the silence just enough to draw attention. She glanced at the screen, then looked up. "Sir," she said carefully, "there is an update." Daniel turned immediately. "What is it?" he asked. The assistant hesitated, then stepped forward, holding the phone slightly out as if the information itself carried weight. "The Carter Growth Fund has just been restructured," she said. A pause. "All active allocations to Carter Industries have been suspended." The words did not land all at once. They unfolded slowly, like something too large to process in a single moment. One of the executives leaned forward sharply. "Suspended?" he repeated. "As in temporarily?" The assistant shook her head slightly. "As in immediately," she said. The room went completely still. Not the earlier tension, not the anxious silence of uncertainty. This was different. This was final. Daniel felt the shift before he fully understood it, a hollow drop in his chest as the last piece of the reality settled into place. He turned toward Richard, searching for something, direction, reassurance, anything that could restore control. But Richard did not move. He simply stood there, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable, as if he had already accepted what the rest of them were still trying to comprehend. "She did not argue," he said quietly. "She did not defend herself." His eyes moved back to the door. "She made a decision." The simplicity of it cut deeper than any accusation could have. No raised voices, no confrontation, just a quiet choice made without hesitation. Daniel looked down at the table, his reflection faintly visible in the polished surface, distorted by the angle, by the weight of everything that had just happened. For the first time, he understood that this was never about removing someone from a room. It was about failing to recognize the value of the person who never needed to be there in the first place. Around him, no one spoke. No one moved. The room that had once been filled with authority, with control, with certainty, now held only the quiet aftermath of a mistake that could not be reversed. And somewhere beyond those walls, Emily Carter walked forward without looking back, not because she had something to prove, but because she never needed their approval to begin with. And in that moment, the world inside that boardroom learned something it would never forget. The strongest position is not the one at the head of the table, but the one that allows you to walk away from it entirely.